I move notice of motion 430, which was given by Mr Davis yesterday, which highlights the jobs crisis that Victoria now faces. A jobs crisis and an economic crisis as a consequence of the policy decisions taken by this government, the Andrews Labor government, over the course of the last 6 months in particular. But it's worth pointing out, Mr President, that the consequences of this government's policies were being seen even before the COVID situation, and in many respects the budget situation we have now and the budget we saw yesterday was well on the path we've seen delivered before COVID started. And we only need to look at the budget update from the end of last year to see the trajectory that things were on in this state, and in many respects COVID has come along at a convenient time for this government to mask the problems it had created. But as a consequence of this government's choices and its panicked response to the COVID pandemic, we now have a major economic and jobs crisis in Victoria. We saw yesterday the government release a budget in which it forecast economic growth for the financial year just finished, that is 30 June 2020, to contract by 0.25%. But we now know that the official ABS figures, which came out last Friday, which would have been after the budget was finalised, actually show that the economy in Victoria contracted by 0.5% in the 1920 financial year. The government forecasts that this year the economy will contract by a further 4%. These are unprecedented numbers. We have not seen this level of contraction in economic activity in this state before. We have not seen the commensurate impact on employment that we are now seeing and will continue to see on the government's own forecasts over the coming 2 years. As I said, Mr President, it didn't have to be this way. It isn't this way in every other state in Australia, and it is not this way in many jurisdictions elsewhere around the world, who managed to contain the COVID situation without destroying their economies and their workforces in the process. But this government knew better, this Premier knew better, and they went down the path of what was effectively a scorched earth approach. And we saw, after the initial response, a then protracted lockdown, which affected particularly metropolitan Melbourne, but also had flow-on effects for the rest of the state. We saw what started out as a strategy to flatten the curve, was the term which was bandied around in this place ad nauseum by the Minister for Health in the first wave of the pandemic, abandoned later on for an unspoken strategy which seemed to have been elimination. And we only need to see some of the rhetoric in the last week and the talk of 28 days now without mystery cases to demonstrate that that was in fact a strategy of elimination, which of course is unlikely to be achieved long term and which gives rise to the prospect of, when cases do reappear in Victoria, as they will, with any cross-border movement, be it international or domestic, gives rise to the prospect of further lockdowns and further scorched earth approaches as the government once again panics, as we saw over the last 6 months. So we've had a scorched earth approach, not dissimilar, Mr Acting President, to a government seeking to eradicate weeds and vermin in a national park, and decide the way to do that is to burn the national park down. That's essentially what we've had over the last 6 months in this government's response to the pandemic. What we saw through the middle of this year in particular, when we hit the second wave, was a distinct lack of planning and a distinct lack of strategy. And on the question of strategy, Mr President, I go to the issue of what the government was seeking to achieve. In April, it was very clear. It was to flatten the curve. It was to reduce the growth in the number of, or the rate and number of COVID cases, to allow the capacity in our health system to be increased to deal with the growth in the number of cases. It was to slow down the rate of growth in cases. It wasn't to eliminate the virus. There was no belief that we could magically eliminate this virus in Victoria. It was to slow down by having social distancing, by restricting the movement of Victorians. It was to slow the growth of the virus, to allow the health system to be, the capacity of the health system to be increased. And we had the then Minister for Health in here talking about the number of beds which would be created, the number of intensive care beds which would be created. And to this date, we don't know whether that was achieved. There is significant question marks over whether the funding that was put into the health system actually delivered the additional beds that the minister claimed would be created. But what we do know is those beds were never needed. We never saw the wild forecasts of hospitalisations and intensive care hospitalisations that were floating around in March and April, even through the worst of the second wave, which was caused by this government's incompetence. We never saw the rates of hospitalisation which had been forecast. But we did have a clear aim back in March, and it was to flatten the curve. It was to reduce the rate of growth so the health system could catch up. With the second wave, the panicked response to the second wave, there was no clear strategy. The Minister for Health, while she was here, before she resigned in protest at the way she was thrown under the bus by the Premier, and the Premier in his own utterances in that second wave response, never once articulated what the government's strategy was, what its objective was, what it was seeking to achieve in locking down the state and crippling the economy and destroying employment, what his objective was. Other than, as I said, Acting President, we now hear talk of, oh, we've eliminated the virus, we've succeeded, which of course isn't the case. While we may not be reporting cases at the moment, inevitably it is still in Australia. Inevitably we will see new cases announced, and the government is going to need to have a strategy to respond to them. And another scorched earth approach is not the answer. Worryingly for Victorian citizens, Mr Acting President, we saw the response to the outbreak in South Australia last week, where the South Australian government, I think, overreacted in shutting down South Australia, and we had the Victorian government react in closing the border to South Australia. And it's worth pointing out this is the first time that the Victorian border was closed, because through Victoria's own second wave, the Victorian border was open to interstate. Other states didn't want us, but the Victorian border was open to people from other states. So for the first time, we closed because of an outbreak of 6, I think it was, in South Australia. We closed the Victoria-South Australian border. And if that is going to be the reaction every time we have a single-digit number of cases in other jurisdictions, it is going to completely undermine any economic recovery and any jobs recovery that we see in Victoria. And it's worrying, Acting President, that there is that lack of clear articulated strategy, which most likely will lead to that sort of panicked and overstated reaction as we saw on the South Australian border. And of course, that will lead to undermining confidence. You cannot expect businesses to start to recover. You cannot expect businesses to start to employ people again if they have no certainty, if they can't have any confidence in the environment in which they are operating. And it's bad enough that the economic environment has been severely undermined without the government creating further uncertainty. The prospect that on any day of the week the Premier may come out and announce we're locking down a part of Melbourne, or we're locking down a state border, or we're going to lock down regional Victoria because we have half a dozen cases, completely undermines confidence. We saw with the second lockdown, which began on the 2nd of August, businesses had made decisions, businesses had planned. Hospitality businesses in particular had only just recommenced operations with severe restrictions on the number of patrons they could have in their venues. They'd ordered food, they'd ordered other stock, only to be told they had to shut again. And the damage that has done, the damage that did then, and the damage the prospect of that does now to businesses which need to make investment decisions, which need to purchase stock, with the threat of an erratic decision from government throwing them completely out of operating, does enormous damage and completely undermines their confidence and their ability to get back on their feet. And while that continues to be the environment in which they are operating, where erratic decisions of government can be made, and as we saw last week, will be made on the flimsiest of evidence, the prospect for an economic recovery is severely undermined and severely limited. Now, I'd like to put in context the numbers and the results we have seen as articulated by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in its most recent labour force publications. And as members know, the ABS published a monthly labour force set of data for every state and territory in Australia as well as for the nation. And looking at that monthly ABS data, comparing the way in which the labour force in Victoria changed from February 2020, which was before the onset of the pandemic, or more particularly before the onset of the government's policy response to the pandemic, and the most recent data of September 2020, we see that in Victoria there has been a loss of 245,000 jobs. From February to September, 245,000 Victorians have lost their job. And in the breakdown of male and female, 102,000 of those were males, 143,000 of those were female. In the split between full-time employment and part-time employment, 159,000 of those jobs were full-time jobs, which highlights that, perhaps contrary to expectations, that thank you. Thanks, Sally. Contrary to expectations, the biggest impact has actually been in the full-time segment of the economy, with 86,000 jobs lost in part-time employment. So this is a very significant impact in a short period of time. And as we see in the budget papers yesterday, the government expects that to get worse, because the government is forecasting over the course of this year, and I highlight a lot of those losses were in the last financial year, the government's highlighting a further drop of employment of 3.25% over this year, and a rise in unemployment to 7.75%. Which means we need to see a substantial further increase in the number of people who are unemployed. We'll see a further substantial increase in the number of people who are unemployed over the course of the 2021 financial year. And it's worth noting, Mr President, where those job losses have been. And the ABS, in that same series of data, breaks the data down between Greater Melbourne and rest of Victoria. And not surprisingly, 220,000 of those lost jobs are in Greater Melbourne, which is a reduction in employment of around 8% from the February peak. For regional Victoria, it's around 25,000 jobs lost, which interestingly is about a 3% reduction. So the heaviest impact, obviously in terms of jobs because of the density, number of jobs because of the density, but in terms of the percentage reduction, is metropolitan Melbourne, which reflects, of course, the fact that it was Melbourne which bore the brunt of the scorched earth policies of this government. So 245,000 jobs lost between February and September, with expectation from the government that more jobs will be lost over the course of this financial year. Now, the question that generates, Mr President, Acting President, is what is the government doing about it? What platform does the government have to assist the restoration of these jobs, which it bears responsibility for destroying? And I've already outlined it doesn't have a strategy. It doesn't have a clear strategy around COVID, which gives businesses confidence that they can invest, gives businesses confidence that they can create employment. But what we do have is a budget yesterday which goes down the path of pump priming. We have a budget which takes on $154 billion in debt, which is equivalent roughly to $23,000 for every man, woman and child in Victoria, which is an extraordinary level of debt accompanied by an extraordinary level of deficit funding. Now, it's interesting, in the budget speech yesterday, in the budget papers yesterday, the Treasurer outlined a forecast or an estimate provided by Deloitte Access Economics as to the impact of this budget, this year's budget, and the estimates over the next 4 years. And Deloitte Access Economics have provided advice to government, included in the budget papers, or the figure included in the budget papers, that they expect the settings announced yesterday, the spending announced yesterday, and the spending over the next 4 years will boost gross state product by $43.9 billion. So the uptick, the boost in economic output is going to be just under $44 billion as a consequence of the spending decisions of this government. Now, anyone who studied high school economics, university economics, is familiar with the concept of pump priming, is familiar with the concept of deficit spending to boost economic activity. Interestingly though, Acting President, that while Deloitte Access Economics forecast an economic boost from this budget of just under $44 billion, the deficit spending in this budget and over the forward estimates is just under $49 billion. So we're incurring $49 billion of deficit spending, that is $49 billion of pump priming, to generate economic activity by the government's own estimate, the government's own consultant, of $44 billion. Now, normally with pump priming you look for a multiplier effect. If you spend $10 billion in pump priming, you'd like to see $10 or $20 or $30 billion in economic benefit. But here we are committing $49 billion in deficit spending over the next 4 years to generate $44 billion in economic activity. 89 cents in the dollar return on that pump priming, which is an extraordinary outcome, Acting President, and does raise questions as to the effectiveness of some of the spending that we're seeing in this budget. One of the things we saw in the budget papers yesterday is a so-called jobs plan. And there is a figure, a target, no detail provided as to what base, what time frame, but a target of 400,000 jobs to be created and 200,000 jobs to be created in the next 2 years. Now, that headline sounds good until you put it in context. And the context, Acting President, is that we have already lost 245,000 jobs. So the government meeting its own target means that in 2 years' time, 45,000 Victorians who had a job at the beginning of this year still will not have a job. Except it's going to be worse than that, because the government expects unemployment to continue to rise and employment to continue to fall. So we're going to lose more jobs before the government assists or creates these 200,000 jobs it claims it will create over the next 2 years. So it'll be more than 45,000 people that had a job at the start of the year still won't have one in 2 years' time. Now, earlier this year, in response to the pandemic and the economic situation created by the government's response to the pandemic, the coalition, Liberal National Coalition, and the leader, Michael O'Brien, published our Back to Work platform, Back to Work, Back in Business. It was published in May in response to the first wave and the economic circumstances arising from the first wave, and refreshed last month in response to the even more devastating second wave. And that policy document called on the government to do a number of things on the employment front, one of which was to commit to create 380,000 jobs by the 1st of July 2022. Why 380,000? Because that is where the Victorian economy was supposed to be tracking prior to COVID. It was about getting Victoria back where it should have been. Not getting Victoria partially back to where it was, but getting it to where it should have been. To replace the jobs that have been lost this year, to deliver the jobs which the government otherwise said it would have created over the next 2 years. So the government's own target of 200,000 falls well short of getting anywhere near where the Victorian economy was, or where the Victorian economy was going to be prior to the COVID situation. The other target in Back to Work was to create 143,000 jobs, youth jobs, by the beginning of 2022. And that reflects the number of young people that have lost jobs in this state. Young people, that is under the age of 24, have been heavily impacted by the loss of jobs, by the employment situation, which has developed and accelerated over the last 6 months in this state. And it's important, particularly important, that we see and we encourage the creation of jobs for young people, because if young people do not have the opportunity to re-enter the workforce or enter the workforce for the first time, the risk of that having long-term consequences is very significant. And we've seen that. We saw that in previous recessions back in the early 90s, where young people couldn't get jobs. It can have, at a young age, it can have lifelong negative consequences for them and for their families. So it's particularly important that the challenge of youth unemployment is addressed and an environment is created which encourages the creation of jobs for young people. And this is not public sector jobs, this is not the government hiring more and more public servants. It's actually creating the economic environment which leads to the creation of businesses and the creation of employment. And that leads to the third target, employment-related target in the Back to Work package. And that is the creation of, or the target of, meeting 57,000 new apprentice starts by March 2022, being the start of the TAFE year in 2022. Why 57,000? That reflects the drop-off in the number of apprenticeships in Victoria over the last 5 years. Under the life of this government, since the election of the Andrews government in 2014, we have seen apprenticeships in this state decimated. The drop-off in apprenticeship starts, apprenticeship commencements, indeed apprenticeship completions is actually worse, has been extreme and will have substantial long-term consequences for this state. Now, one of the reasons for that is the framework we have for apprentices. The incentives, or lack of incentives rather, for employers to take on apprentices. And I'm not talking in terms of cost or salaries or that type of support, though the federal government has announced support in that area. Whether it will be effective or not remains to be seen. But the fundamental issue of having young people who are suitable to take on apprenticeships. Yesterday we saw an announcement from the Education Minister that the distinction between VCE and VCAL will be removed over the next couple of years. Now, this is potentially a worrying direction for anyone seeking an apprenticeship, anyone seeking to hire an apprentice, because we saw a similar move back in the early 1990s with the first introduction of the VCE and the shutdown of Victorian technical schools and the development of a so-called single path, now in VCE, which completely undermined the capacity of young people who wanted to go into apprenticeships to get the core foundation skills they needed to start an apprenticeship. VCAL was created to nominally address that. It didn't. The lack of technical schools ensured we still weren't giving young people the skills they required to start apprenticeships. Yet now we're seeing, with the announcement yesterday, again, an apparent merging of VCE, nominally the academic stream, and VCAL, the technical stream, in a single certificate, which, if history serves and the current example of the VCAL stream serves, will mean we will not be providing the type of technical education which is needed to provide a pathway to apprenticeships. In that regard, Mr. President, I'd like to refer to an email I received, I think it was 2 weeks ago, from an employer in Western Victoria who runs the proprietor of a small engineering business, who wrote about the plight of apprenticeships. And to quote his email, quote, "When these students left the technical school, they certainly weren't a qualified tradesperson. but what they did have was a full education covering all the basics on how to use virtually all the tools and equipment that they would be expected to use in their future workplaces, whether that be as a builder, electrician, fitter and turner / engineer, mechanic, plumber, welder, wool classer, etc. For example, in fitting and turning we were taught how to drill a hole in various types of metals, what speed to turn the drill at for various drill bit diameters, what lubrication to use on the drill bit for the different materials we were drilling into, and then how to resharpen the drill bit when it became blunt or broken. We were also taught how to set up basic metal turning engineer's lathe, how to sharpen their cutting tools and how to use them, making all sorts of different items. We made model aircraft, we made stools to sit on, tables, all sorts of boxes to keep things in, and so on. It goes on to say, the knowledge we gained over the full 5 years in the trade subjects mentioned above was immense and just simply can't be given or even taught or passed on the same level in a normal commercial workplace, i.e. on the job. The knowledge gained was immense over numerous different trades, giving a student exposure to several different potential roles and careers, and once one was selected, there was a certain amount of crossover tooling and basic expertise required. He goes on to say, it's got to a point now where automotive garages, experienced plumbers, builders, etc., especially smaller businesses, are extremely reluctant to take on a school leaver simply because they haven't had the technical schooling background that they themselves were privileged to have. They and we have all tried time and time again without success to employ school leavers without traditional technical school training. More often than not, they only lasted a few months, and it's got to the point now where we simply don't bother but look for a mature age person with the skills. I know several garages and plumbers that have decided to stay small with just 1 or 2 workers and just not bother with apprentices. It's very sad. Most of these tradies are now in their 60s and have a wealth of experience to give, but the frustration of taking on someone without the technical school education is too great. I can assure you that it's a sad situation for both the school leavers who don't get an apprenticeship or start in industry and the employers. I've spoken to numerous potential apprentice employers in all different trades and they would love the reintroduction of traditional technical schools. Like myself, they too see the VET system as having absolutely no comparison to a traditional technical school education. VET is merely putting a band-aid on the problem of unemployable school leavers. And that, Acting President, highlights one of the challenges we have with technical education, or the lack of technical education in Victoria. The announcement yesterday of the government combining the VCAL qualification and VCE does nothing to alleviate that concern. We continue to have a lack of real technical education of the sort my correspondent highlighted, of providing actual real technical skills to young people to make them employable for apprenticeships. And while that continues to be the case, we will continue to have a crisis in attracting people, and both employers and candidates for apprenticeships. So, Acting President, we're in a situation now that we shouldn't be in. The scorched earth approach of this government has created a jobs crisis, has created an economic crisis. It wasn't necessary, it hasn't happened elsewhere in the world, it hasn't happened elsewhere in Australia. The government was woefully underprepared to deal with the challenges of different industry sectors, as we saw with the flat-footed deer-in-headlights approach as the lockdown started, and individual industries were unable to get advice from government as to what they needed to do. Individual industries were not supported as they were subject to government mandate that they shut their doors. Despite the record spend we see in yesterday's budget, there is little confidence that the government has the platform and has the tools to help restore the economy. 245,000 jobs lost to date. On the government's own forecast, more to come. We have record spend, but what we don't have is the policy and the strategy to ensure that we can get Victoria's economy and Victoria's workforce back on track.